Hi there, I'm glad that you can join me today. Today's story is titled, How Howler the Wolf Got His Name. Let's get started. Peter Rabbit never had seen Howler the Wolf, but he had heard his voice in the distance, and the mere sound had given him cold shivers. It just went all through him. It was very different from the voice of Old Man Coyote. Old Man Coyote is bad enough, sounding as it does like many voices, but there is not in it that terrible fierceness which the voice of his big cousin contains. Peter had no desire to hear it any nearer. The first time he met his cousin Jumper the Hare, he asked him about Howler, for Jumper had come down to the Green Forest from the great woods where Howler lives and is feared. "Did you hear him?" exclaimed Jumper. "I hope he won't take it into his head to come down here." "I don't believe he will, because it is too near the homes of men. If the sound of his voice way off there gave you cold shivers, I'm afraid you'd shake all to pieces if you heard him close by. He's just as fierce as his voice sounds. There is one thing about him that I like, though, and that is he gives fair warning when he is hunting. He doesn't come sneaking about without a sound like Tufty the Lynx. He hunts like Bowser the Hound, and lets you know that he is out hunting." "Did you ever hear how he got his name?" "No. How did he get his name?" asked Peter eagerly. "Well, of course, it's a family name now, and is handed down and has been for years and years. Ever since the first wolf began hunting way back when the world was young," explained Jumper. "For a long time the first wolf had no name. Most of the other animals and birds had names, but nothing seemed to just fit the big gray wolf. He looked a great deal like his cousin Mr. Dog, and still more like his other cousin Mr. Coyote. But he was stronger than either, could run faster and farther than either, and had quite as wonderful a nose as both. With Mr. Wolf, as with all other animals, life was an easy matter at first. There was plenty to eat, and everybody was on good terms with everybody else. But there came a time, as you know, when food became scarce. It was then that the big learned to hunt the small, and fear was born into the world. Mr. Wolf was swift of leg and keen of nose. His teeth were long and sharp, and he was so strong that there were few he feared to fight with. In fact, he didn't know fear at all, for he simply kept out of the way of those who were too big and strong for him to fight. Most people like to do things they know they can do well. Mr. Wolf early learned the joy of hunting. "I can't understand it myself, can you?" Peter shook his head. "You see, neither Jumper nor Peter ever have hunted anyone in all their lives. It is always they who are hunted. Perhaps it is because he was so strong of wind and leg that he enjoyed running, and because he was so keen of nose that he enjoyed following a trail. Anyway, he despised spending his time sneaking about as his cousin Mr. Coyote did, but chose to follow the swiftest runners and to match his nose and speed and skill against their speed and wits. He didn't bother to hunt little people like us when there were big people like Mr. Deer. The longer and harder the hunt, the more Mr. Wolf seemed to enjoy it. At first he hunted silently, running swiftly with his nose to the ground, but this gave the ones he hunted very little chance. He was upon them before they even suspected that he was on their trail. It always made Mr. Wolf feel mean. He never could hold his head and his tail up after that kind of a hunt. He felt so like a sneak that he just had to put his tail between his legs for shame. There was nothing to be proud about in such a hunt. One night he sat thinking about it. gentle Mistress Moon looked down at him through the treetops, and something inside him urged him to tell her his troubles. He pointed his sharp nose up at her, opened his mouth, and because she was so far away, did his best to make her hear. That was the very first wolf howl ever heard. There was something very lonely and shivery and terrible in the sound, and all who heard it shook with fear. Mr. Wolf didn't know this, but he did know that he felt better for howling. So every night he pointed his nose up at Mistress Moon and howled. It happened that once as he did this, a deer jumped at the first sound and rushed away in great fright. This gave Mr. Wolf an idea. The next day he went hunting. He threw up his head and howled at the very first smell of fresh tracks. That day he had the longest hunt he had ever known, for the deer had had fair warning. Mr. Wolf didn't get the deer because Mr. Deer swam across a lake and so got away. But he returned home in high spirits in spite of an empty stomach. You see, he felt that it had been a fair hunt. After that, he always gave fair warning. As he ran, he howled for very joy. No longer did he carry his bushy tail between his legs, for no longer did he feel like a coward and a sneak. Instead, he carried it proudly. Of all the animals who hunted, he was the only one who gave fair warning, and he felt that he had a right to be proud. All the others hunted by stealth. He alone hunted openly and boldly. Now this earned for him first the dislike and then the hatred of the other hunters. You see, when he was hunting, he spoiled the hunting of those who stole soft-footed through the green forest and caught their victims by surprise. The little people heard his voice and either hid away or were on guard, so that it was hard work for the silent hunters to surprise them. At the sound of his hunting cry, old King Bear, who was king no longer, would growl a deep, rumbly, grumbly growl, though he didn't mind so much as some, because he did very little hunting. He wouldn't have done any if food had not been so scarce, because he would have been entirely satisfied with berries and roots if he could have found enough. Mr. Lynx and Mr. Panther would snarl angrily. Mr. Coyote and Mr. Fox would show their teeth and mutter about what they would do to Mr. Wolf if only they were big enough and strong enough and brave enough. Of course, it wasn't long before Mr. Wolf discovered that he had no friends. The little people feared him and the big people hated him because he spoiled their hunting. But he didn't mind. In fact, he looked down on Mr. Lynx and Mr. Panther and Mr. Coyote and Mr. Fox, and when he met them, he lifted his tail a little more proudly than ever. Sometimes he would howl out of pure mischief just to spoil the hunting of the others. So, little by little, he began to be spoken of as Howler the Wolf, and after a little while, everybody called him Howler. Of course, Howler taught his children how to hunt, and that the only honorable and fair way was to give those they hunted fair warning. So it grew to be a habit of the wolf family to give fair warning that they were about, and then trust to their wind and wits and speed and noses to catch those they were after. The result was that they grew strong, able to travel long distances, keen of nose and sharp of wit. Because the big people hated them and the little people feared them, they lived by themselves and so formed the habit of hunting together for company. It has been so ever since, and the name Howler has been handed down to this day. No sound in all the great woods carries with it more fear than does the voice of Howler the Wolf, and no one hunts so openly, boldly, and honorably. Be thankful, Peter, that Howler never comes down to the Green Forest, but stays far from the homes of men." "I am," said Peter. "Just the same, I think he deserves a better name for the fair way in which he hunts, though his name certainly does fit him. I would a lot rather be caught by someone who had given me fair warning than by someone who came sneaking after me and gave me no warning. But I don't want to be caught at all, so I think I'll hurry back to the dear old briar patch." And Peter did. And that's the end. Thank you for joining me for another story. Come again soon. Take care.